to see you all and to be able to learn Torah together for Parshat Va'era, which is the second Parsha in the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. And this Parsha is when the plagues begin. So we're actually going to skip the first chapter of the Parsha because it's setting us up for the plagues, and I want to instead dive right into the plagues themselves. So in Parshat Va'era, we have the first 7 plagues. And I'm going to share my screen so that you can see the text that we are looking at today. Sorry, I'm just adjusting. Can everybody see? Just like a thumbs up, you can see the text. Okay, great. So I can also pull up the Hebrew on here. So if there are questions that come up about the Hebrew, please let me know and I'll pull up the original Hebrew as well. So we're in chapter 7 of the book of Exodus. Before I get more into the topic and how I want us to start looking at our plagues today, let's say our blessing for Torah study together. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher nitanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. All right. So one of the things that I find most interesting about the plagues is in the specific words themselves, but also in the plagues' overall structure. So the plagues, we know there are 10, and they are divided mostly into 3 sets of 3, with the 10th plague being the climax of all of them. Has this group studied that together, like looking at the different groupings of plagues and what they have in common and that stuff? No, not yet. Okay, great. Okay, so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So I'm just going to write out sort of the different groupings, and I'm going to hold up the piece of paper that I'm writing on. So the plagues are organized into 3 sets of 3. Plagues 1, 2, and 3 have things in common. 4, 5, and 6 have things in common. 7, 8, and 9 have things in common. We also see 1, 4, and 7. There are commonalities, 2, 5, and 8, and 3, 6, and 9. So as we are looking at the text of the plagues, I want us to be thinking about what are we noticing that is coming up in the plagues that we are looking at? And as we go plague by plague, we'll see, however many we get through, what are the similarities and differences? What kinds of patterns are we noticing? And I'll give us a few just so as we read, we can be aware and pick out some of those things. And then I'd also like us to be thinking about, well, why do any of these patterns matter? Is this intentional? Is this not intentional? Is this worth noticing? Is this worth talking about or not? What are we making of this? So one of the patterns that various scholars have noted is that in the first 2 sets of plagues, 1 through 6, there's the first 2 that come in the sets, there are different warnings that Pharaoh gets before the plagues happen. So they don't just come out of nowhere. Pharaoh gets a warning, and then it's a plague. And then the first in each set all happen in the morning. Pharaoh is doing something, and Moses is told to literally station himself before Pharaoh and say something to Pharaoh. In the second in each set, Moses is told to come in before Pharaoh. Moses is told to confront Pharaoh in the palace. And then in the first set, 1 through 3, Aaron is actually the agent who makes the plagues happen. And in the last set, 7 through 9, it's Moses who is the agent who makes the plagues happen. So we have a bunch of different people, a bunch of different settings. You'll see the time of day comes into play. But those are all the things I want us to be noticing as we're reading the text together. What kinds of patterns are coming up? What kinds of details are jumping out to you as we go through each plague? Okay, so the first plague begins, we're right here with verse 14 in chapter 7. And Adonai said to Moses, Pharaoh is stubborn. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning as he is coming out of the water, and station yourself before him at the edge of the Nile, taking with you that rod that turned into a snake, which we read about earlier in the Parshat. And say to him, Adonai, the God of the Hebrews, sent me to you to say, let my people go that they may worship me in the wilderness. But you have paid no heed until now. Thus says Adonai, by this you shall know that I am Adonai. See, I shall strike the water in the Nile with the rod that is in my hand, and it will be turned to blood, and the fish in the Nile will die. The Nile will stink, so that the Egyptians will find it impossible to drink the water of the Nile. Okay. I'm going to scroll down. And Adonai said to Moses, say to Aaron, now we're introducing another new person, say to Aaron, take your rod and hold out your arm over the waters of Egypt, its rivers, its canals, its ponds, and its bodies of water, that they may turn to blood. There shall be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in vessels of wood and stone. Moses and Aaron did just as Adonai commanded. He lifted up the rod and struck the water in the Nile in the sight of Pharaoh and his courtiers, and all the water in the Nile was turned to blood, and the fish in the Nile died. The Nile stank so that the Egyptians could not drink from the water in the Nile, and there was blood throughout the land of Egypt. But when the Egyptian magician priests did the same with their spells, Pharaoh's heart stiffened, and he did not heed them, as Adonai had spoken. Pharaoh turned and went into his palace, paying no regard even to this. And all the Egyptians had to dig round about the Nile for drinking water, because they could not drink the water of the Nile. All right, that's our first plague. So what jumps out to you? What details, words, or phrases are you noticing? And I can also adjust the format if that makes it easier to see. You can sort of see more of it this way. Benjamin.
Thank you, Rabbi. Well, I'm not sure if this is answering your question, but this is to me, it's a multi-pronged plague. You got water turn into blood, dead fish. What else? Just a lot. It's more than one plague in one plague.
Yeah, and it's right. So we usually say, like during the Passover Seder, when we dip, our finger into the wine and spill out a bit of wine for each plague, and we say the plague is dam, the plague is blood, but the plague seems to be more than just blood. There's a lot happening here. Great. Rebecca.
To me, it has to do with fluid movement. So fish are fluid in the water. Blood is fluid through your vessels. It has to do with fluidness.
Nice. So what was once fluid is now no longer fluid, or just like a different type of fluidity?
The fluidity has been tarnished. I can't say it's been halted because the Nile's still flowing, I'm assuming.
Right. But it's been tainted in a way where it's no longer useful the way it was originally.
Right, tainted, that's the word. Thank you.
Thank you. Brad and then Cindy.
Well, I guess it's a little point, but when it says that Pharaoh came out of the water,
yes,
that struck me because I thought, of course, of Moses, who also emerged from the water. And I'm wondering why that parallel is being drawn here.
Nice. And I think we're meant to make that connection that you just made. And it's not just any water, like Moses is coming, like Moses came out of the Nile, and Pharaoh, it says he's coming out of the water, station yourself before him at the edge of the Nile. The implication is Pharaoh is also bathing in the Nile, the same place that Moses was drawn out of, and now Pharaoh is being drawn out. And the piece about going to Pharaoh in the morning that you said, I also want to highlight, because that go to Pharaoh in the morning comes up in other plagues as well. So Cindy, and then I want to like go a little deeper into why water and the connection with Moses.
I'm just going a little different way.
Yeah.
The line that fascinates me is let my people go so they may worship me in the wilderness. So
Yeah.
it's not asking that, well, necessarily the freedom issue, but not that we can go to a new land, or that he's talking yet about going to Canaan, that he's just talking about the wilderness, that he really doesn't know where they're going yet.
Nice. So there's nothing about the promised land that's here, even though we know throughout the wanderings in the wilderness, that is always the final destination and the place that they are working towards and moving towards. But that's never part of what God is talking about here. And it's interesting that, you know, we use this phrase, let my people go, all the time. That's such a familiar phrase, but really that's only half of it. It's let my people go that they may worship me. And that's the phrase that we see repeated over and over again. God doesn't say just let my people go. It's really not focused on like freedom for freedom's sake. There's something attached to freedom. It's bigger. It's like, it's just bigger than that. Yeah, Jonathan.
Well, I don't mean to derail from what you just brought us on to, but I was a little piqued about Brad's question about the comparison between, or parallels between Pharaoh and Moses. And one thing I've always noticed, and maybe I'll be a little bit risky in bringing this up. It's a fairly charged political season right now, but I'll just say it to everybody. I myself am, even though I think a lot of you know that I'm kind of center of the road politically, I myself am not a huge fan of Elon Musk. I'll just say that. And the reason that I have that opinion is because I can't quite trust him, because he is absolutely beloved by the religious right and agrees with them on a number of issues, from social to economic and so on and so forth. But when you really look at who he is and what he's going for and what his personal, I guess you'd say, beliefs are, who he is, what his perspective is, he's really completely opposed to the religious right in a lot of his philosophies. And it's sort of that kind of, when I compared that to Brad's question, I thought, well, a lot of times in life, your worst enemy, or the greatest danger, is the guy that you're going to love the most and agree with the most, who, you know, when it comes down to it, there's something in him that's just a little bit different that's going to set him against you. And so your most dangerous enemy sometimes is your greatest friend. So, you know, beware of Greeks bearing gifts is another thing. You know, the nice guy, or it can be a sort of a temptation. And Egypt sort of represents that as a whole. Pharaoh had everything that the Israelites generally wanted in terms of, you know, wealth and prosperity and safety and all of this sort of stuff. And Moses was asking them to go out into the desert. But the guys were, you know, very similar, both royal Egyptians, and they, you know, had a number of similarities and so on. And so I guess that kind of speaks to me about how it can be a little bit difficult sometimes, or to distinguish friend from foe, because they'll often come from you know, very much the same place. So I guess I kind of wanted to add that. I've noticed that in my life. I've, you know, seen it in scriptures, you know, villains that, you know, act just like heroes, so on and so forth. So I thought, yeah, that is a kind of an interesting parallel to look at just exactly how similar are Moses and Pharaoh. They're really not that different in a lot of ways, but it's that sort of critical element that just turns them into completely different people.
And that they're like emerging from the same stuff, and that they lived in the same palace together. And then I think it shows what a stark, I think like that similarity also reflects the stark contrast between like what is good and what is evil, because they came from something that was so connected. Thank you. Susan, go ahead.
I'm going back to the text rather than to politics. I see a lot of, and Cindy brought this out, I believe, with water and fluid. And each time we're dealing with the Nile and with water, and we in Southern California know the importance of water. There's 1.2 that he says to hold, I've lost the place now. Hold your, oh, here it is, rivers, canals, ponds, and all bodies of water that may turn to blood. And we know that the Nile was the lifeblood. And we also use those terms, lifeblood, relating to the river. So I think that's, and of course, the Torah believes in blood as the life-giving force. And now the blood is turned to death. So I think there's a big emphasis here on not only the Nile, but water, which is a source of life. I mean, we came from the water if you go back to evolution, which they weren't doing, but at that point, but it's there. Babies are in the womb in a liquid. So
Nice. And oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
no, that's it. The symbolism there of water and the Nile and life and death and blood.
I think that's such important symbolism to note here, especially because in Judaism there's a phrase, and it comes from the Torah, and it's used in different settings, mostly related to mikveh. The phrase "mayim chaim," which when it's used in the Torah, it means like living water. Like Miriam had this well of living water, which meant fresh water. But it's also used in Judaism in terms of the connection between water and life, and how those things are so intertwined. And then the blood we see later with sacrifices, and how blood like plays different transformational roles in sacrifices, and we know water plays different kinds of transformational roles in our tradition. And so juxtaposing the two is also very interesting, and turning one into the other. And what was life-giving to people now becomes something that is making it so that they cannot live in the same way, but with something that's also inside of us and inherent to who we are and the way our bodies work and what give us life. It's like the play on life and death here, just in the first plague, especially knowing which plague we're going to end with, I think makes it such an interesting like bracketing of the plagues as a whole. Lorraine and then Brad.
Yes, I do have a weak signal, so if you missed something, my apologies. I wanted to thank Cindy for bringing up that quote that she uplifted, because it's very interesting. I didn't realize I'm focusing on the word wilderness, because it says, "Let my people go that they may worship me in the wilderness," right? Like, it's almost like a foreshadowing that we will be spending all this time in the wilderness,
Yes.
transforming our behaviors, transforming into the people that we need to be before we enter the land. So I had not noticed that, and it's just so interesting that it could have been so that they may go to the land, but it's not. It's actually almost like the destination was the wilderness. So and And it reminds me that has been told and taught to me that there's no extra words in the Torah. Everything
Yeah.
is perfect. Everything is meant to fit the way it is. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorraine. And yeah, what Lorraine is referring to is in the Talmud, Rabbi Akiva talks about how like every letter, every little crown above, the different letters in the Torah, all of it has a purpose. That's one of the ways that I approach the text, is just like an automatic assumption that everything has a purpose and a meaning and is there for a reason, and is there for us to uncover. Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm coming back to this comparison between Moses and Pharaoh. I'm sort of hung up on that because it doesn't make sense to me. The hero of our story is not Moses, it's God.
Yeah.
In fact, Moses is not mentioned in the Haggadah. So the battle is between Moses and not Moses. The
Pharaoh.
battle is between our God, and their God, Pharaoh. And Moses is not, he isn't, he's only indirectly part of that equation. So all of a sudden, to compare Moses and Pharaoh seems displaced when the rivalry really is between God and Pharaoh, our God and their God.
I think the way I think about it is because God is in a realm that's like the story is constructed in this way and like you said, the fact that Moses isn't even mentioned in the Haggadah, like elevating God beyond all people, like anything that was, done by a person in the Torah, which is why I think the Moses Pharaoh comparison is interesting, because they're both people. And like, for me, God still exists above that. Is how I'm reading it. I don't know if others are reading it differently. Yeah, well, Brad, yeah. And I see what you're saying. Rebecca, do you want to?
I remember as a kid being impressed with the rod, and all of a sudden that word is coming out to me again. What is with the rod? What is the power in the rod? Is God in the rod? What is that?
So God seems to have given Moses and Aaron this rod, and through that rod, God creates some sort of magic. And so what happened at the beginning of the Parshat is like all these sorcerers in Egypt cast down their rods, who turned to snakes, and then Aaron cast down this rod and it turned to a big snake that ate all the other snakes. So God seems to be showing God's self and the miracles that God is capable of performing through this rod. And then we see the rod come up over and over again.
I'm wondering, maybe Brad can address this. I'm wondering if the rod has also significance with the Egyptian culture, in that perhaps when the Egyptians saw the rod, that would cause them to pause.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know enough about it. Does anybody else know?
Well, the magicians in the court had rods as well.
Yeah.
They couldn't turn into snakes, so we know that just from that passage, not that I know anything about Egyptian magic, but he called in his magicians and sorcerers, and they had rods also, but those rods didn't work. So I don't know that. I think that Brad opened a good question about it's really our God versus Pharaoh as the incarnation of a God. However, this has to be told, I think, in human terms. And the pharaohs were considered an incarnation of gods because they were human. That's what I would believe. So, and Moses is a messenger, a prophet. and following God's commands, his words. So you're dealing with a messenger, a prophet, versus a so-called incarnation of God, but a false one, as far as that goes, you know. So I think that could kind of resolve that issue that Brad brought up.
Nice.
And I know in the Haggadah, I'm sorry that Moses isn't in there, but on the other hand, there's also this prohibition, we don't know, against worshiping someone Moses, like it was said, we don't know where Moses was buried, we don't know where Mount Sinai actually is. So I think these problems can be resolved somewhat, even though they're still up there as issues.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, and like that elevation of God throughout our story. Okay, any other comments on the very first plague? Okay, we are going to start looking at plague number 2. I'm just going to scroll down. So we're starting with verse, wait, let me see. Okay, with verse 25. When 7 days had passed after Adonai struck the Nile, Adonai said to Moses, "Go to Pharaoh and say to him, 'Thus says Adonai, let my people go that they may worship me. If you refuse to let them go, then I will plague your whole country with frogs. The Nile shall swarm with frogs, and they shall come up and enter your palace, your bedchamber and your bed, the houses of your courtiers and your people, and your ovens and your kneading bowls. The frogs shall come up on you and on your people and on all of your courtiers.'" And Adonai says to Moses, "Say to Aaron, hold out your arm with the rod over the rivers, the canals, and the ponds. Bring up the frogs on the land of Egypt." Aaron held out his arm over the waters of Egypt, and the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magician priests did the same with their spells and brought frogs upon the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Plead with Adonai to remove the frogs from me and my people, and I will let the people go to sacrifice to Adonai." And Moses said to Pharaoh, "You may have this triumph over me. For what time shall I plead in behalf of you and your courtiers and your people that the frogs be cut off from you and your houses to remain only in the Nile?" "For tomorrow," he replied. And Moses said, "As you say, that you may know that there is none like our God Adonai. The frogs shall retreat from you and your courtiers and all your people. They shall remain only in the Nile." Then Moses and Aaron left Pharaoh's presence, and Moses cried out to Adonai in the matter of the frogs, which had been inflicted upon Pharaoh. And Adonai did as Moses asked. The frogs died out in the houses, the courtyards, and the fields, and they piled them up in heaps till the land stank. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he became stubborn and would not heed them, as Adonai had spoken.
So
Plague number 2. What is jumping out from plague number 2?
for me, one thing, there's a lot of stinking in this business here, which I hadn't really noticed before. And there's more to come. The frog was a goddess in Egyptian cosmology, a goddess of fertility. So interestingly, that's a good thing. On the other hand, too much good turns into something despicable. Although the little frogs that we have, little plastic ones that can jump at that I have for the kids at Seder, are delightful. But they don't stink, and we can put them away. But that's the fun part.
That's something I think about every year with the frogs and the puppets and all of those things. It's so much fun for all the kids at Seder, and like, let's be honest, for all the adults also at Seder. And at the same time, like when you read what these plagues are, they are so horrific, and like you know, the sensory experience of it is really like, it's interesting the way that the Torah tries to like bring you in via that sensory experience. Yeah, Benjamin.
Thank you, Rabbi. I'm not sure how this fits in, but today we know frogs are a key indicator to scientists as to changes in ecosystems. So frogs are usually the first species to experience different manifestations of a change of an ecosystem, climate, pollution, what have you. We look at the frogs and they start having issues. We can then assume that those issues are of importance to higher animals in the food chain. But frogs are very significant as a first indicator of that. You know, God would have known that, of course, but
That's so
interesting.
interesting. I've never known that. And that also, when there are like so many different theories about how the plagues might have happened naturally, that like the Nile turning to blood was this red sediment that was running through the water at that time of the year. And then if that was happening, then the frogs had to emerge from the water and needed someplace to go. So they went on land. And if that was happening, and so we do see, like you're saying, if we're looking at frogs as this indicator of what's about to happen, like we see so much happening with wildlife later on. That's so interesting scientifically. I never knew that. Jonathan and then Brad.
I actually was going to go on a similar thing. I had heard that, or one of the explanations, the naturalistic explanation that could connect the two miracles or events, was that there was a gigantic, naturally occurring anthrax outbreak. We think of it as a manufactured chemical, but it actually can, under rare circumstances, show up in huge ways in nature and is occasionally responsible for just massive animal decimation and so on. And so a lot of people think that anthrax hit the river and then, killed everything in the river and then drove a bunch of things that could get out of the river, like amphibians and lizards and whatnot, onto the land. And yeah, I'm totally, whatever you see, if you want to describe it as miraculous or natural or whatever, there's going to be some kind of a process, whether you can identify it or not. But whether or not it was an anthrax or natural, one of the things to note is that there does seem to be like a connection or a progression to where the first miracle is like your river that you're going to go to get help from that you need, that's not going to be there for you. And then it didn't change them. So then the next thing is that river that wasn't going to help you, that you can't get anything from off anymore, it's actually coming after you now.
Right.
So it's sort of like if you resist the power of God, first of all, or resist what God's purpose for you is, or your plan or whatever, then first of all, you're going to find doors closed so that you can't move forward. Now, if you're still not getting the picture, if God wants you to go somewhere where you're not, and the next thing that's going to happen is, life is going to start coming after you, push you, into the direction he wants you to go. And so I definitely see, there is some connection, naturalistic, thematic, and all of that, a progression between these plagues that's supposed to bring out, an intended result. And you can see the building of it. Yeah.
And like the building, also in like spatially, like you're talking about, where with the first plague it said, okay, it's the Nile, but it's also the vessels that hold water in your homes. And then this is saying it is in your bedroom, it is in your bed. It's just like everything is getting closer and closer and closer to your body. Brad and then Susan.
Yeah, I thought of the fact that Aristophanes wrote a very famous play called The Frogs. And I wanted to remind myself of it, and I found this little blurb. The Frogs is an apt representation of the central theme of the play, which is the fickleness and chaos of the political world. And that's exactly what we're seeing here is fickleness, Pharaoh's fickleness, and the frogs, the din is creates a chaotic situation. So it's much more than the little frogs that we put on the table. I mean, this is really a menace. It is an interesting parallel between the Greek and the Hebrew text.
That's so interesting. I never have heard anybody make that connection before. That's so interesting. And I think it's especially clear here how menacing it is, like you were talking about specifically for Pharaoh, because this is also it's so bad for Pharaoh that this is the first time when Pharaoh says, plead with Adonai. It's the first time Pharaoh actually acknowledges God. And Pharaoh uses God's name, and that's how bad it is that Pharaoh's kind of saying okay, this is so horrible. I acknowledge that you're God. There is something happening, and I'm even going to say that name and appeal to your God. Susan.
Yeah, I really like that. Thank you, Brad. But just in terms of nature, the Nile had turned to blood, and the frogs are living in the Nile, and if it's all bloody, they're out of there, and that's when they create the chaos there. So anyway, that's if you wanted just a nature-based response to that, there you have it. But I think it's also interesting, and I'm not the first to point this out, that these first plagues are all dealing with nature. So it's God of nature. Water, we'll get to boils, the animals, and the like. And then in Exodus will be the God of history and of creation of the Jewish people. So we've got both Elohim and then Adonai coming.
Nice. And there are really interesting analyses, especially of the first plague, looking at what is done by Elohim and what is done by Adonai, specifically laid out like that. That would be a good Torah study for next year for this Parsha. Really, yeah, especially with the first plague because it's so detailed and it's longer. Very interesting analyses with that. Thank you. One other thing I thought was interesting about this second plague is here in verse 8 when it says, Moses cries out to Adonai in the manner of the frogs which had been inflicted upon Pharaoh, that when Moses is talking to God about it, I just think it's interesting that we know that this plague, the frogs were impacting more people than just Pharaoh. But when Moses appeals to God, Pharaoh is the one who Moses brings up and not more people. I just thought that was interesting. Okay, any last comments about plague number 2? Okay. In our last few minutes, instead of starting plague number 3, I'd like to go back to the question that we started with about the structure of these plagues, different patterns that emerge in the text. And we've talked about even the progression that we have seen in the first 2 and, different connections between them. I'm curious what folks make of those patterns, those connections. Does it feel intentional? Does it change the way you read or understand or relate to the story at all? Is it something you think about during the Seder? Yeah, curious to hear what you make of the patterns and larger structure. Should we read the third plague instead? Okay, Susan, go ahead.
I can't put it together, and I think that's just a waning of gray matter in the brain. So I like the words and the symbolism. I get it that there is a pattern, and there's certainly a pattern in the Ten Commandments and the like. I can get some of that pattern, but this supersedes my capacity to acknowledge all these different patterns. So can you enlighten me in any of this?
Yeah, and it's harder when I guess when it's not like visually laid out. We've only looked at two
Yeah.
plagues, but yeah, so I think it's also it makes it harder in that sense. But like little things like I was talking about at the beginning, how in like first sets of like these patterns of like in this set of plagues happen in the morning. In these set of plagues, there's a warning that comes also, and there's also a warning that Pharaoh gets before the plagues come. That in this set, like we saw this in these first two plagues, how Aaron is the one who's carrying these out, and it's not Moses, which I think is really interesting. And Moses is the one carrying out the last three of the plagues. That there's some intentionality. It seems to me there's some intentionality there, but there are just different groupings within the plagues and different patterns. Does that make more sense?
Yes, I get the sense of it all. I just can't.
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether it serves a larger purpose or
Okay.
it's just a literary device, like in poetry or something, like the first two lines comport with one another, and the other.
Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking. It's more of a
Yeah.
literary kind of a deal, because I don't totally see a larger pattern unless it ends with the last three, with Moses being the primary agent. So, and I'm not sure with the morning versus it ends with night and the death of the firstborn.
Right.
So, maybe that's a literary kind of a thing. Morning,
Yeah.
night, Moses, Aaron versus Moses, uh, that kind of a thing. Morning versus
Right.
no morning.
Nice. And like land and water, there's a lot of like binaries that are happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, Rebecca, did you want to say something?
Do the groupings, I think there's a numerical pattern. But do those numerical patterns have anything to do with the patterns of creation?
Oh, that's interesting. I I don't know. I've never looked into it that way. That's very interesting. I'm not sure. I think at the end of the first plague with those 7 days, I thought that was very interesting also, like that relating back to creation of like there's something holistic between the first plague and the second plague that's happening. And maybe like a rest or a break, like some kind of significant break in that way. But that's interesting between the plagues and creation. I think for me, I do look at these structures. Susan, like you were saying, like poetry, it feels like an intentional way that the Torah is saying not only are there miracles and otherworldliness in the way in the plagues themselves and how they're carried out, but there's also a deeper intentionality and different kinds of hidden meanings, even in the process of carrying out each of those things. And so to me, it makes it even more amazing. And I mean, I think like I feel weird using the word beautiful when it comes to plagues because these are so horrible, like such horrible things. And I think there's a beauty in the language here that to me says God had something so much bigger and so intentional in mind when not just orchestrating the plagues themselves, but orchestrating the details of all of the plagues, where they happened, how they happened, when they happened, who did what kinds of props like the rod or arm or whatever was used. To me, it gives the plagues as a whole a sense of poetry and holistic nature, where it's not just 10 terrible random things that may or may not be able to be explained naturally, but they're really so intentional. And to me, like a deeper appreciation there for God's power, but also like the wisdom and intelligence of the design of all of this that God is coming with, that it's not just might, but there's also like a lot of intentional thought behind what we're seeing. So with that, I want to thank everybody so much for participating in our Torah study today. I'll be with you again in 2 weeks, which I'm looking forward to. Wishing you all a Shabbat Shalom. May our city, may our world find peace this week.
Thank
Shabbat
you.
Shalom,
Shabbat Shalom.
everybody.
Shabbat
Thank
shalom,
you.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
everyone.
Thank you.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.